Hello, my name is Dr. Ryan Anderson. I'm one of the co-founders of Telos U. I'm here today to help you learn some things about the processing approach. The processing approach may be perhaps the most important of our tools that we want to try to teach you. This is something we specifically developed here at Telos for working with our students because we found that without this approach, people like our students tended to not be able to make progress. And efforts to try to help them learn and grow and develop into young adults oftentimes was very, very frustrating. So we want to help you get very familiar with this tool and get very comfortable with using it yourself. One thing to know about the processing approach is that in many ways it's kind of a meta tool. No matter what other tool you are using, you are always going to be using the processing approach as well. It becomes the lens through which we see everything else and the first door through which we pass on our way to any other kind of intervention. We found it to be that influential that we are literally always using it. Now, it is designed for people when they are flooded, or also to help people out with their vulnerabilities to becoming flooded and overstimulated and overwhelmed. And while we specifically designed this for people who have information processing disorders, one thing to keep in mind is that everyone has some degree of vulnerability to being flooded. And therefore, this is a tool that can be useful for anyone when dealing with anything that has any kind of emotional load or any kind of difficulty associated with it. So this is a good tool to learn and to apply liberally, both with your Telos U student, but in any other areas in your life where you deal with issues that are emotionally sensitive. Now, to do this properly, you do need to be able to approach other people with a heart at peace. If you've not yet read the book, The Anatomy of Peace, or The Outward Mindset, we heavily recommend that you do so, because trying to use the processing approach without having a heart at peace tends to not be effective at all. But this has to do with the tone of our hearts towards other people. Are we seeing them as a person or as an object? Are they as real to us as we are to ourselves? Or are we somehow diminishing them and minimizing them? One of the things that's important to recognize is even if we externally do the right things, if the state of our heart towards the other person is not right, if we're seeing them as an object, if our heart is at war, even the right things are not able to get the right kinds of outcomes that we're looking for. And so being very well aware of this state of our heart is crucial for anything else we're doing. And if you ever find yourself in a position where it feels like things aren't working, this is the first thing for you to examine is how am I doing on having a heart at peace, having an attitude of compassion, understanding, kindness in the way that I approach these difficult situations. And along with that also comes what we call the Teflon demeanor. We talked about this in the relationship continuum and in several other places. It's that ability to recognize that when the other person is spouting out things that are designed to be hurtful and inciting, that's not about us. And rather than turning that into an attack, defend sort of pattern, allowing ourselves to say, this is a distraction, this isn't what's really going on. I'm not going to allow myself to take the bait of getting emotionally upset about whatever they're putting out while they're emotionally upset. I'm going to look beyond that with X-ray vision to see what's underneath this. And that's going to be the part that I focus on. So there are a couple of key factors. The whole idea behind the processing approach is recognizing that when we are flooded, when we have taken in more information, whether that's physical information, emotional information, physical stimulus, that our ability to process through and effectively understand, deal with emotions, and then transform that into actions is severely impaired. So there are several steps we can do to help ourselves avoid getting flooded and overwhelmed in the first place and deal with being flooded and overwhelmed when it's occurring. The first thing is to slow things down wherever possible. Instead of rushing towards some kind of resolution that feels emotionally important to us, to say, okay, whoa, I can see that this has gotten overwhelmed. Rather than hitting the accelerator, we're going to hit the brakes. We're going to slow down how quickly we talk about things, how fast we're trying to get to a resolution, and we're going to give time for other people's funnels to drain, help them reduce their tension and their stress. Now, sometimes this means that other things will give. We might sometimes be late to something. Something that we would prefer to have done earlier may occur later. But slowing things down is like taking 5 extra minutes to save yourself 5 hours of trouble later. It is worth the exchange, and we heavily recommend that we do it. And while you're slowing things down, you're trying to take a look at what are the other person's needs. The reason they've dug in their heels is because something doesn't feel like it's working for them. And that's what we have to learn to explore and try to understand. It's also important to help them walk through our thinking as well, not just assume that they know what we're perceiving, what we're thinking, what we're hoping for. We break it down, we slow it down, we help make sure it's something they understand, and we try to do the same for them as well. Also, when giving instructions, give one instruction at a time. Don't give a list of, here's 5 things, go do those 5 things and come back. It's, all right, here's the next thing that needs to be done. Go ahead and do that, and then we can check in afterwards about the next step. That's just less stressful. It's putting less things in their working memory. They're more likely to be successful. Now, the next is, as we slow things down, we're trying to cut things up into smaller bite-sized pieces, whether that's pieces of a task or pieces of information to consider. And we want to keep it as simple as possible. So you might say, go and clean your room. That means a lot of different things. But if you're saying, hey, could I have you go, and I noticed there's a pile of laundry on the floor. Could you pick that up and put that into your laundry basket? So now what you mean is very clear by that piece. And you could come back and say, okay, there's a couple of other things. The next thing is, again, describe it. So take the big task, break it into little pieces, focus on those little pieces one at a time, keep it simple. And again, you have to ask yourself, what really matters? Everything can't be important at a 10 out of 10. There are some things that are really not as important, and you can let them slide. Ask yourself, what really matters in this situation? And can I focus on the things that really matter? And the things that are not as important, am I willing to give those some time and space and let those happen? Another thing to keep in mind is that when we're trying to work with someone on something that is an overwhelming task for them, we don't want to be in their space, but we also don't want to be so far away that we're not there and available to give some kind of help. So being physically close and emotionally close and safe to offer support if needed, to be there, to be a sounding board, to let them know that they're not alone in the thing they're feeling overwhelmed with, can be an incredibly important part. So we are an arm around the shoulder rather than a confronting face to their face. And it should feel non-threatening. It should feel like we're invested in them being successful and that we care about the emotional experience they have while they're working on being successful. One thing to keep in mind is that anytime you're trying to give some kind of a direction, make sure that you've actually gotten into their line of sight and that they have eye contact with you before you try to give an instruction. Don't assume that they've heard you. Even if they say, yeah, if you haven't had face-to-face contact, don't assume that they've heard and understood what it is you're trying to instruct them in. We need to go into things with a willingness to compromise. Again, the outcome is what matters most. And you have to be clear, what is your dog in this fight? And you have to also be clear about what can genuinely be flexible. Now, you should not compromise on important principles, but you can compromise a lot on how you accomplish the outcomes that would be indicated by those principles. If you are rigid, you're going to invite rigidity from them. So there's a whole other webinar called Rolling with Resistance. We recommend that you take a look at that because that goes into this in great depth. Be flexible on methods, but not on principles. And sometimes you need to give a little. Sometimes you need to be willing to compromise 20% to get 80% of what you want. And that can be what it takes for them to get unstuck. That's something that we call the 80-20 principle. look at what you can give, look at where you can compromise, look at what would make things a better experience for them. And you'd be surprised that you don't have to sacrifice everything that's important to you. Sometimes it's a small percentage to get what matters most. And again, you want to compromise and problem solve, but you don't want to bribe. Bribing in the end is really not helpful. It's a short-term solution at best, which becomes less effective over time. You want to find something that feels like a genuinely workable solution for them and for you. Another thing to keep in mind is what we call the 3 C's. And anything that we're trying to communicate with other people, it's very easy for miscommunication to happen. So we want to think about 3 principles in our communication. One, we want to make it very clear. When we're trying to make something understood, avoid metaphors, abstractions, or implying things. Say exactly what you mean. Make it concrete. Help break it down into things that are visible, touchable, measurable, things that can be objectively, so to speak, seen between the two of you and agreed upon, and also well communicated. Sometimes what that means is you need to help the other person connect the dots between things that you might think are just understood or are just obvious. So keep in mind, anytime you're running into difficulty or when someone's under stress, these become more important. Break it down, slow it down, be very clear, make it concrete, make it well communicated. Now, the next principle is the idea of forecasting. Flexibility and shifting can be difficult for people who have information processing issues. And for all of us under stress, this becomes difficult. So the more that we can try to help them see what is probably coming in the future, and the more lead time we can give them on that, the better. Now, it's true that sometimes things will unexpectedly change without us being able to predict that. But the more we can make predictions and forecast what's coming before it happens, then the more likely the person is going to be able to roll with the punches when something unexpected does occur. So give heads up about transitions. Hey, later this afternoon, we're doing X, Y, and Z. I'm going to check in with you 30 minutes ahead of time to help you begin the process of shifting and getting ready to go. And then when that 30-minute comes, hey, remember earlier today we talked about we would be doing X, and I'd be giving you sort of a 30-minute heads up that it'll be time to start shifting. Well, now it's time. So knowing that that prompt is coming, but also giving time for the shift is helpful. And so a lot of ways it's preparing to prepare to prepare to transition. And again, this is the 2 extra minutes that saves you an hour later on. So give as much lead time as you can whenever possible. When something changed and plans have had to change, be explicit. This is what changed. And this is why the time frame or the task had to change. Don't assume that they just understand why things changed. Another piece is front loading. Now, some of you may be old enough to remember the really old computers where in the beginning you had to load the operating system before you could do anything with the computer because it had so little memory. So one of the things we have to keep in mind is a lot of our students have a more narrow working memory compared to other parts of their IQ, which means sometimes they may not be holding something in working memory that will be helpful for them. So part of what we want to do is as we are going into a situation where they need to remember a specific idea or piece of information or expectation or skill that they're going to be trying to use, we want to help them load that into their working memory. And this works really well with the forecasting in conjunction with the front loading. So we can say, hey, look, we're going to be going on this activity later today. Now, I know it's been hard that sometimes if you are not winning in the game the way you would like to, that you tend to have this certain difficulty. You and your therapist have been working on this specific skill to help you so that you don't have that blow up. So as we go into this, I want us both to keep our eyes on when you start to get frustrated and help you work on trying to use that skill that your therapist has been working on with you. And I'll be there to help if you need my help. So something as small as that, here's the expectation. This is the old pattern that we want to try to avoid. Here's what we're going to be trying to do. Here's your part in it. Here's my part in it. And this tends to help things go much, much better. So again, I think about this as loading something into their working memory. So it's actually available for them to use when they need it. We want to make sure we also have reasonable expectations, because sometimes the biggest disappointment is that our expectation of what they're ready for is wrong, and therefore we get frustrated, or they haven't yet developed a realistic expectation of a situation as well. So don't go in with the idea that, look, my child should be able to do this because this is what all other people their age can do. That's not what this is about. This is about who are they, what's their development, how much weight are they carrying on their backs, what are they currently capable of, and what's realistic, and calibrating our expectations to that. And also helping them create realistic expectations for themselves and other people. And sometimes that's walking things through, learning about what they're thinking about the situation, and then breaking things down, connecting dots, slowing things down, and helping them maybe develop a more realistic expectation. But not just telling them, don't expect X, expect Y. We need to walk them through, help them know what we're seeing, what we're experiencing, that help us know that a different expectation is more reasonable. Because keep in mind, when expectations are not met, that's a time when people can get flooded. So the more we can work on this, the better. There's also supervision and follow through. One thing to keep in mind is that especially when people are learning to deal with new situations that have been overwhelming for them in the past, just expecting them to go through it solo is very difficult. Now, we don't want to come in and treat them like a child, but we do want to make sure that we have enough presence for them in the activity or the situation that's challenging for them, that we can be there to help them monitor the situation, because they may not be able to monitor all the important pieces on their own yet, that we're there to support, and we're there to redirect if they're finding they're having a really hard time doing so. So we want to be constantly aware of the amount of stimulation, the amount of temptation in the environment, what they're currently capable of, what they're going to be working on, and when we might need to help them reroute for us to try again later after they've developed more skill and ability in the area. But what you want to do is you don't want to wait until the moment of crisis. You want to help them decide what they're going to be doing, but if you can see that they're stuck, then it's okay to step in and intervene before things get to a full crisis level. And don't assume that they understood what happened. After this has all gone through, and if you've needed to intervene or redirect, or even if they've been successful, you still want to follow up on what happened, help them recognize what they did that helped things go well, or take a look at what threw them off and help them figure out what you want to try to do differently next time. So keep in mind that if we set expectations, but we give no follow-up, then those expectations tend to be useless. It's inspect what you expect. Keep in mind as well that many of our students have had a lot of experiences that feel like social failures, and therefore they're particularly sensitive to public criticism. So whenever possible, when feedback is needed, find a way to pull them aside and provide it in private. So be mindful of not creating shame, because shame will shut them down. It won't motivate them. And when we give this kind of corrective feedback, it should be given in a friendly, warm, arm around the shoulder way, rather than a, hey, you're messing up and you should do better. And again, you want to be helping them connect the dots, understand what wasn't working, get a sense of what they were perceiving, figure out what maybe they were missing, and then help them re-engage. So this would be a great time to use the consultant pattern. Again, this is something you'll be trained on in family days. There's a webinar on it. And also you should be working on this in family therapy. One thing to keep in mind in everything we're doing, the processing approach is a process to help the other person process. It's how we communicate, it's how we connect with each of our students in a way that works with their processing styles and strengths and helps them compensate for their processing deficits. And as we do this, we use this as a lens for everything else that we do. We slow things down, and that includes when our own emotions are high, when we're anxious about something, when there's something that's important to us. And when we allow ourselves to use the processing approach, we are giving out information, intervening, and supporting in a way that the other person can receive, even when they are stressed and even when their funnel is flooded. So we heavily encourage you to work with us to become very confident in your understanding and in your application of the processing approach.